All right. Well, we have a lot of content to cover, and we're excited about making sure that there's plenty of opportunity for questions at the end. So let's get started. First of all, hello. I hope you're enjoying Adobe Summit so far. We're going to be talking, as you know, about the factors that we found related to the success of experience optimization using Adobe Target for Subway. Very familiar brand. I'm Jeff Larsch. I'm an I'm a personalization lead, the personalization practice in Accenture. With me is Chad Sanderson. He's the experience optimization lead for Subway. And before we get into the content, just a little nomenclature. When we talk about personalization and experience optimization, or just optimization, please know those are all the same thing. So what Accenture has done for Subway as part of a greater digital transformation that started about 2 years ago is we have stood up an experience optimization service. So A/B tests turned into personalization for Subway. And we did that by creating the whole structure of the operating model. And we also brought with us our philosophy for personalization. So our point of view is that personalization is using customer data to improve the customer experience at every touch point. And what's significantly missing is terms like upsell and cross-sell and profitability. It's not that those things aren't important, and it's not that those things aren't actually being achieved. It's just that we feel that if you focus on what the customer wants to do in that channel, that the rest will follow. And it definitely has. In fact, this mobile app that you see here, which Accenture helped to design and build and is now being run by the Subway team, its main purpose is to help people to find the closest Subway, to choose the food that they'd like, to pay for it and pick it up. Obviously, if we can optimize that experience, revenues will go up. And in fact, this service has not been running for a year, and it's on course for annual revenue generated, new revenue of $1 million, which is not bad. And it's probably going to wind up being more than that, because every time we add a new personalization based on A/B testing using Adobe Target, it's another layer of revenue on the top line. The other cool thing is that Accenture has designed this service so that we are swapping out Accenture folks for Subway full-time hires. And what that means is that expenses are going down and stabilizing while those revenues go up. So ROI is going up considerably. So that is the story that you'll be hearing today. We've learned some things while we have been running the service for Subway. Chad and I both have a lot of experience that has been validated by what we've done at Subway. And so to begin, Chad is going to touch upon what we've learned.
Yep. So before we start, a little bit about me. Before I got into the experimentation, optimization, personalization industry, I was a martial arts instructor, as these photos can clearly, or maybe not so clearly, demonstrate. And being a martial arts instructor has a lot of similarities with running an optimization program. So, for example, if you're building a competitive team, you need to develop a set of systems. The first system that you really need to have is you need to have a way of figuring out what are the strengths and weaknesses of all of your students, right? People are different. Some people are really tall. Some people are really short. Some people are really strong. Some people are really fast. You can't teach everybody the exact same way, because if you give them this generic template, you're going to end up with a generic result, okay? So the next system that you need is a way of figuring out, okay, now that we know what the person is, we know what their strengths and weaknesses are, what are we actually going to teach them, right? What are the techniques that fit their body type the best, that fit their mental aptitude the best? And then finally, you need a system of exploiting those strengths that you've been teaching to the whole time, right? One of the things I always saw as an instructor is it was really easy to teach someone things when you're practicing, right? When you're in a gym and when it's you and your friends or whatever, it's easy to do the things that you've gone over. But as soon as you get into a competitive environment, if you haven't trained to operate in a competitive environment, it all goes out the window, okay? So in a similar way, you need to structure your optimization program, right? You need to have systems. You need to have a system of discovering what are the strongest elements on your site that you should be personalizing, that you should be testing for, okay? You need to have a system for then prioritizing those elements. So of all the great ideas that we could possibly launch, which are the ones that we should be launching first, second, third, fourth? Maybe never, right? You need to have an objective system in place to do that. And then finally, you need to have a system of analyzing your data so that you're able to take advantage of all the work that you've done, okay? A test has so many elements to it. You've got to develop it, you've got to, you may have creative attached to it, you've got to ideate with it, you need to get approvals. If your analysis is not good, then it's all going to be wasted. So these are some of the points, these systems that we're going to be covering in this presentation today. Okay. The most important part, in my opinion, of any optimization or personalization program is that you make it scalable. Okay? If it doesn't scale, then it's going to stay at the same size and shape and efficiency as it is when you start. And that's no good. Nobody likes that, right? The way that you make a program scale is to continuously optimize it the same way that we're trying to optimize our digital properties. If you're not optimizing your processes and you're not optimizing your systems, then those systems are never going to grow. All right. So, like I mentioned before, we're going to focus on 3 key profit-driving systems in this presentation. Number 1 is hypothesis generation. How do we create good ideas, right? How do we not create ideas that are not likely to win? Number 2, how do we prioritize those ideas? How do we build a model so that we can objectively step back and be able to rank all the ideas that we've built? And then number 3, how do we come up with a system of analyzing data to where every single time we don't have to do this ad hoc analysis and we're trying to figure out what's going on? We can say, this is what we decided to look at, this is what we achieved, and this is what we're going to implement. Now, before we move on, before we get into the real meat of this presentation, there's a few things I wanted to talk about to just cover generally, right? The first one is that what we're doing here, experimentation, A/B testing, personalization, all of that is science, okay? It's science that has been done before it was embraced by marketing. Marketing is kind of a last mover. It's late to this whole experimentation game, okay? That's my background. That means that we need to start employing a lot of the rigor that is used in science. And I used to be a testing consultant, and what I've seen is working with a lot of big-name brands is that the rigor is not there. Usually, you have testing done based on people's opinions. The processes aren't really formulated, okay? The second thing that I want everybody to keep in mind, and actually it's pretty awesome because when I was at the keynote this morning, a lot of people were talking about how this personalization thing and machine learning and all that is not easy. And I think that's a different viewpoint than this industry has had in the past, right? Usually people are saying, yeah, just get our program and then money is just going to rain from the sky. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, that's actually not the case. That's not true. There's a lot of work that goes into this. So sometimes when you see things like case studies, as awesome as case studies are and as much as everybody loves them, you might be falling prey to something called survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is a form of cognitive bias where you only see the good stuff, not because there's only good stuff, but because people only talk about the good stuff, right? People don't talk about all the personalization and all the optimization that fails. So even if only 1% of personalization campaigns wins, well, that's what's going in the case study, right? So I want you to keep that in mind as we're going through all of this, and just know that you're not going to implement a strong personalization system and just be making millions of dollars right out of the gate. It is a process, and any incremental value is really, really good.
So we're going to start with hypothesis building. And you probably read about how important a hypothesis is in an A/B test. But what you might not know is why. It has to do with something that Chad had mentioned, cognitive biases. Sort of the gasoline of the engine of experience optimization is these crazy behaviors that are invisible but are very measurable. And the power of Adobe Target is it uses math to sort of cut through all of the unpredictable behavior that people exhibit and provide the best experience regardless. It does things that humans just wouldn't be able to predict. So what is a cognitive bias? Well, one was already mentioned. That was survivorship bias. The tendency we have to think something is easier than it really is because all we've heard are the success stories. But there are two others that are going on right here in Las Vegas in the casinos. One is called confirmation bias. And that's seeing patterns, runs, and streaks in random data where none exist. We're actually believing these. These phantoms are influencing our prediction. And here's an example of where you might actually have experienced this yourself. Tell me if this sounds familiar. So you're gambling and you tell your friends, hey, I'm going to play for another hour, then I'm going to go back to the room and we'll go off and do something else. An hour goes by, an hour and 10 minutes, an hour and 20 minutes. Finally, they come to get you. And you look up from the table and say, I can't leave now. I'm on a roll. Or I can't leave now. My luck is just about to change. That's confirmation bias. Here's another one that goes on in the casinos. I call it ownership bias, but I guess the technical term is loss aversion. That's where you're watching your friend play cards against the dealer, and the cards have been dealt out. There's another card that's about to be dealt. It's obvious that the dealer is going to fold. But your friend doesn't double down. Why not? Well, it's because they value the chips that they already have more than the greater number of chips that statistics tell them and common sense tell them they could win. So why am I telling you all this? Well, it's because we can't educate these biases out of our own brains. It's not just the gas that fuels experience optimization, but it can really mess things up unless we use hypotheses. Now, let me give you an example, a demonstration of just how innate these biases are. All right. By a show of hands, how many of you have gambled so far this visit or will gamble? How many people are planning on gambling? Okay, good number. It's a fun, obviously, it's a fun thing to do. So probably about a third. So all of you who raised your hands, I want you to tell me with a show of hands, how many of you think you're better at it than these two? Trick question, because these are really clever monkeys. This is a capuchin monkey. There was a whole colony of them that participated in a scientific experiment, a long-term test conducted by some researchers in the UK about a dozen years ago. And I know what you're thinking, and I want to tell you in advance, no monkeys were harmed in the conduct of this experiment. In fact, it's just the opposite. What they did was they taught these capuchin monkeys that these silver discs were like money. So whenever the monkey handed in a disc, it would get a grape back, and they loved grapes. So they valued it just like you and I would value a poker chip. So then what they did is, well, this was a capuchin monkey's day during this experiment. The monkey would get up, they'd be handed some chips, they would go and they would gamble all day. The researchers would run these simple games of chance that the monkeys could grasp, and they calculated how the monkeys did. And then at the end of the day, they cashed in their winnings. Yeah, not cruel. That's not what I would call cruel. In fact, my parents have another word for this. They call it retirement. But here's the amazing thing. So they recorded all of these risk-averse behaviors. And then they did the same thing with grad students. Same data set. Experts could not tell the difference between the two of them. Now, these are very educated psychology students. And yet, what they discovered is that this risk aversion, this loss aversion, is something that is so innate it probably predates us as humans. So you can't factor them out. Now, here's why hypotheses are important. You, as the A/B tester, need to use a very careful hypothesis because otherwise you're going to lie to yourself and you're not even going to realize it. To use the immortal words, to paraphrase the immortal words of Christopher Wallace, better known as Biggie Smalls, to not use a hypothesis is to get high on your own supply of cognitive bias. All right, so what is a good hypothesis then? Well, there are 4 components to it. Clearly defined testing objective. You need to know what it is you really want to find out. You also need to know, there has to be a really strong reason for why you're doing it. There's a business motive or a user experience improvement that you know has really been dogging your business. Also need to know who you're going to be testing this with, because individuals can be identified by their segments, as you know. And finally, you have to build on the foundation of your past tests, and if you don't do that, you're really missing out, because you can get this amazing synergy as you build test and insight upon test and insight and test and insight. So what you could do is write a hypothesis that says, we believe that some idea will have a measurable outcome. And this is because of things that we believe, and it can be measured by a concrete metric. Now, for those of you who are relatively new to using Target or other systems for A/B tests, there are only parts of building a hypothesis that really get a lot of newbies, and Chad's going to describe them.
Yeah,
sorry.
So in this list, in my experience, there's 2 areas where people really fall down. Not so much in the first one. We believe some idea, right? People have a lot of ideas. That's the easy part. And will result in a measurable outcome. People can usually figure that one out too. But the difficult part is in the because of reasons backed by data. Most A/B test ideas and personalization ideas that I hear are not based on data. It's based on things that we believe, maybe because we saw it somewhere else, maybe because of intuition. For example, I think that we should personalize based on time of day because I believe that's what people want. Do you have any data that supports that? Do you have any sort of information that indicates that personalizing based on a specific hour in the day is going to lead to more conversions down the road? If you don't, then this is no different than coming up with something out of a fever dream, right? There's other types of data besides our imagination. The biggest one that I hope everyone here has experience with is quantitative data, right? This is the Adobe Summit. I hope we're all using Adobe Analytics. So analytics data is super, super important whenever you're ideating tests, right? What I like to do first is to always check things like drop-off reports or page flow reports so that I can see, okay, at this particular step in the funnel, we're losing 30% of people, and at other steps, we're only losing 10%. Maybe I can start creating some ideas on why that is, and then that will be the beginning of my hypothesis. Or I can look at page flows. You know, maybe the conversion rate for someone going from the home page to a category page to a product page to a cart page is 5%. But if someone goes from home page, then to product page, then back to home page, and then back to product page, and then to cart page, is actually 15%. Now, there might be a lot of reasons for why that is, but I can always start testing based on the data that I've observed, okay? Big problem is a lot of people stop there, though. They think that quantitative data is the only type of data that they have available to them, and that's not true at all. So quantitative data answers the what is happening. But qualitative data answers the why. And usually qualitative data is like way cheaper than quantitative data. In fact, all of us have access to it right now if you have customers by just talking to them, asking them, how was your web experience? Where did you run into trouble? Where were there problems? Why did you leave if you didn't buy anything? Right? Answering these questions is super important, and it's really, really easy to build tests around those. Okay? Another great place to start that's completely free, that's accessible to pretty much everybody right now, is talking to your customer support agents, right? or your customer service people. These are individuals who spend all day fielding complaints, oftentimes about your digital properties, right? If you ask one of them, hey, give me the top 10 problems that people have when they call you, well, every single one of those reasons, if you fix them, is probably affecting a very large percentage of your users, okay? And it's probably affecting way more than you think, because it takes a lot of effort and energy to call and complain about something. The majority of people who experience that particular issue are probably doing nothing. They just get irritated and maybe don't use your service anymore. So if you fix one of those, then you're improving the customer flow and the customer journey for a huge amount of people. All right, so that's data collection. The final point where I see people struggle is can be measured by a concrete metric. A lot of people go wrong here. Reason why is sometimes what we think is a primary output of a particular test isn't that important to the business, right? For example, page views. Let's say that I increased page views to a particular page by 20%. What does that mean? It means I increased the number of people who saw that page. Is that important to the business? Is it important that 10% more people saw a page? Or is it important that 10% more people bought a product, or 10% more people did something relevant to the company? Okay? Oftentimes, it's really, really easy to get caught up in these web metrics that mean nothing. So clicking a button, going to a page, watching a video, that's all well and good, but if it's not affecting a primary business goal, then you need to start over and think about how you need to measure something that is. Okay? All right, so here's an example of a bad hypothesis versus a good hypothesis. So if you're in marketing, or if you're a creative, or if you've really ever worked in a business, you've probably heard something similar to this thing on the left here. Having a hero banner is better than not having one. What does that mean? How do we describe better in this situation? Is it more people are going to buy? There's more awareness about a particular campaign. We've increased revenue per visitor. We've increased average order value. We've increased the number of people who go to a page. It could be anything. The problem with this statement is that it's not falsifiable. You cannot run a test or a personalization effort and disprove this unless you get a horrendous result. And usually those don't happen if you have a pretty decent website. The example on the right is a much better hypothesis, so let's just go through it quickly. We believe that adding a hero banner to the top of the homepage, note how specific that statement is, will result in the visitor being more informed about new promotional campaigns because of independent qualitative research that has confirmed this, that's the data element, which can be measured by an increase in the amount of average revenue per visitor. Okay? The good part about this hypothesis is that we can falsify it. We can do a test, we can run a personalization effort, and figure out if we're wrong. And then we can go back to the drawing board and start over. Okay, so that's hypothesis building, which is the first set of systems that we talked about in the beginning. This is the second set, prioritization. So now that we have a system of building out good ideas, how do we decide which good ideas need to go in? Right? It's easy to come up with ideas. I can come up with 50, 60 ideas. You can come up with 50, 60 ideas. But can we run 110 ideas back to back to back to back? The answer is probably not. Right? So, go ahead. So what you need to have in any business is some type of model that takes this decision-making process out of your hands. It makes it objective. Right? Big reason this is important is because if you have stakeholders and they all have test ideas, or they all have personalization ideas, you need to have an objective way of saying, yeah, we can't do that right now, sorry. Okay? This is the type of model that we use at Subway. It's a very simplified version of this model, but I'm going to explain it to you briefly. Every single column that you see here is a different form of testing criteria. We have experimental criteria, and we also have business criteria. Okay? For each criteria, we have a weight associated with it. That means a score, basically. Every single test gets a different score depending on the column. The scores are then tabulated. The highest score gets the highest priority. Pretty easy, right? Pretty straightforward. So what are the types of criteria that we could use? Well, the answer is basically anything. I have built a custom model for Subway. I hope that you build a custom model for your business. You don't have to use the things that I've used up here. In fact, I'd recommend that you don't use these things because these may not be as important to you. But just to go over a few examples of what you could include. Like I mentioned, there's two different types of criteria. One is experimental, and one is business related. Experimental metrics are usually based on things that you've observed in prior tests, or maybe if you have experience running tests and personalizations in another company, it can come from that. It can come from even reading blogs or something. So for example, let's say that we've observed, after running a few tests on our website, that if a test occurs above the fold, it seems to win slightly more often than if it doesn't. Okay? And if you don't know what above the fold is, that's where if you go onto a website, the first thing that you see without scrolling down, that's above the fold, right? Everything else is below the fold. So then we'd assign a weight to that. We'd say, well, we don't think it's super important, but we do see a slight positive effect. So anything above the fold, any test above the fold gets a value of 1. Any test below the fold gets a value of 0. But we may have higher weightings as well. Maybe we notice something about the type of personalization and the type of test that we're running. So one thing that I've seen in my experience is that when you are changing the actual structure of the page itself, usually you see some effect. Whether that's positive or negative, can't really say, but usually an effect happens. So we may decide to rate that higher. We may decide to give any tests that do that a score of 5. And if you're testing something where maybe it's a little bit harder to notice, like copy or color, we'll give that a lower rating because typically it doesn't move the needle as strongly. So some examples of some business metrics that you definitely want to include here. ROI, for sure, right? What is the predicted revenue or engagement or lift over time or whatever it is for this particular test? If you're doing a test that is minor, so we're changing the color of a call to action, probably not going to result in an increase of $50 million a year. You know, don't believe the case studies. But if you're testing something huge, like an entire checkout flow, for example, if you're changing a funnel down to its very nature, there's a very good chance that you're going to affect something strongly. Okay? So you may want to give that a slightly higher priority.
So you can summarize any dimension that you're ranking by 2 different dimensions, actually. The vertical is value to the organization. The horizontal, you can rank as level of effort. If you are weighting something by how much time IT is going to be involved to build the test, or if they're involved at all, or the series of approvals, that would be a high level of effort. That would be toward the left, but toward the right is extremely easy. So as you prioritize, if each of these circles was a test, the ones in the upper right-hand quadrant, those are going to be the sweet spot that you'd start with. You'd focus on running those tests first because they really will be optimized. And because this is very dynamic, by the time you finish those tests, you're going to have others that float in there as well. So, for example, let's say that test number I, or letter I, is for this, which is the swapping of 2 panels on the homepage of the Subway site. Well, it's in that sweet spot because it has the potential to deliver a great deal of value. Its order now is one of the main calls to action that we want to optimize around, and it's above the fold. But also the level of effort was very small. It was just generating a little bit of JavaScript, and we were able to run the test.
Okay, so a few last points about prioritization models that everybody should keep in mind. The first one is that, like I mentioned before, our goal is not just to optimize our digital properties, it's also to optimize all the processes that are associated with our program in general. Okay? So just because you build a model doesn't mean that it should be static. It should always be changing. You should always be updating it. A really simple way of doing that is just as you learn more about your what works, what personalization works, what tests work, change your columns, change the weightings. If we run 10 tests and we think that being above the fold and below the fold means something, but after we run 100, we don't particularly see any difference for either one, we might remove that column altogether. We may say that this is not particularly important to our process. Another way is adding new columns, and I strongly encourage all of you to do this and to really think out of the box about what sort of criteria is important to you. One of the ones that we use at Subway is likelihood to be rejected by a stakeholder, right? I'm serious. And the way that we can measure that is pretty simple. If a particular test has to go through a lot of gatekeepers, then there's a really high chance that one of them has the capability of shutting that test down. They don't like how it looks. They don't think it's going to work. There's a new campaign that's going to run on that page, and they've prioritized what they want and don't want to do what we want. So we might want to prioritize those criteria or tests that only need to go through one person, and that's it. Okay, so that's what I mean about evolving your model over time. The second thing is if you want to get into data science, or if you have statisticians available, you could always turn this into a predictive model relatively easily, actually. It's not that hard to do. So you could use something like linear regression, you could use principal component analysis, and you could start making predictions based on your inputs. So you might say, for example, I have a score of 24, my model predicts that that's going to result in a lift of $2. Okay? And obviously, if you have any model, you don't take it 100% at face value, but you could use it as a barometer and make that model better over time. So I'm not saying that everybody obviously has to do that if you don't have that capability within your organization, but you can go there if you want and if you have the resources to do so. All right, so this guy is awesome. His name is Richard Feynman. He's a physicist. And he has a quote that I really, really like, which is the easiest person to fool is yourself. Now, Jeff talked about cognitive biases earlier and why it's easy to fool ourselves from a bias perspective. And oftentimes that applies to analysis of optimization and personalization as well, mainly because we're biased when we create them. We want these things to win, right? That's kind of our bias. We build them out hoping that they're going to work. Our stakeholders are depending on us to produce revenue. The company is depending on us to produce revenue. We don't want to launch an entire personalization campaign and then it comes back, yeah, that didn't do anything, sorry. So sometimes we can look at data too hard. We can look until we find something that's not really there. Okay? In fact, this is relatively common. And one of the easiest ways to understand it is a fallacy that I've termed the blind basketball player fallacy. So imagine this. Imagine that we're in a basketball gym and the stands are full of people, random number, let's just say 100 or 200. Okay? We ask each person, each one of those 100 or 200 people, to come down to the free throw line, put on a blindfold, take a basketball, and shoot it. Now, would we be super surprised if one or two people made that shot? No. No, we would not. Why? Why not? That's it. That's it. It's bound to happen. Statistically, it is bound to happen at some point, right? The more people that you add, the more trials that you run, the more likely it is that you see a result that doesn't really mean that that person is an amazing blindfolded basketball shooter. So how does this apply to personalization and A/B testing? Well, imagine if we are running an A/B test with 10 different variations. Pretty common, right? This is the equivalent of asking 10 different people to come down to our free throw line, put on a blindfold, and take a shot. All right, now imagine that we decide to do a little bit of analysis, a little bit of segmentation, and we want to look at new and returning visitors and desktop and mobile visitors. Okay, well, including our aggregate segment, that's everything where we looked at it all together, that's 5 separate segments, right? 5 segments, 10 variations, that's 50 tests. That's the equivalent of asking 50 people to come down to the free throw line, put on a blindfold, and take a shot. Would we be super surprised to see a significant result out of 50 people? The answer is probably not, right? Not only is it likely that we're going to see that, it's almost guaranteed that we're going to see that at some point. Okay? So one of the questions I get sometimes is, if optimization and A/B test works, why is it that a lot of times when I implement some of these tests, the results go away, right? The revenue goes down. This big win that I got before doesn't last that long. Well, this is why. It was never a winner to begin with. But if you're looking at a huge number of segments and a huge number of tests, you're going to find some significant values that were never there. Okay. So the best way to handle this is a process called pre-registration. Okay. This is a borrowed term from science, from the experimental discipline. Super easy to understand. All you have to do is set your limits in advance. So before you actually run a test or before you run a personalization, you say, this is my hypothesis. This is how long I'm going to let the test run for. This is how many people are going to see it. These are the metrics that I'm going to observe, and these are the segments I'm going to observe, and that's it. I'm done. Why is that effective? Well, imagine that instead of calling out all 100 or 200 people to the basketball court, you pick out 1 or 2 that you believe have qualities of being a really skilled blindfolded shooter, and then they make it. A much higher chance that those people are actually skilled blindfolded basketball players. Okay, so that's step 1. But what I don't want to discourage you from doing is exploratory analysis. So exploratory analysis is when you just look for interesting things, right? You look for, did we see a lift with new visitors who only buy pants on Wednesdays? Did we see a lift with people who come in on a tablet on the weekend and have 3 children? But what I don't want you to do is to regard those results as amazing and share them all out with your stakeholders. You should regard them as interesting. And then you can go back, formulate a new hypothesis that says, we believe that people who come to the website on a weekend and have 3 kids and buy pants or whatever are more likely to see an increase in conversion rate because of whatever reasons it is, and then you run the test again. And if you win a second time, well, that's the equivalent of having 100 people in a room, 1 person out of those 100 makes a blindfolded basketball shot, and then you call that person back a second time and they do it twice. Okay? Much more likely that that is a truly significant value than a random effect. Okay? All right, so I know everybody in the room just physically recoiled. This is math, and you might not believe it, but statistics is insanely important to what we do. I mean, like fundamental, bedrock. All of experimentation and all of personalization is built off of statistics. If you don't understand this on a foundational layer, you're opening yourself up to so many traps. So many problems. And that doesn't mean that you personally have to do it. It doesn't mean that you personally have to be some PhD level expert, but you should at least understand all the problems you may encounter. So here's one example. The graph on the left is a distribution graph. If you've never seen it before, it basically just looks at how frequently do we see a particular value. Red, we can assume, is our control, and blue, we can assume, is our treatment. So what this is really saying is that on average, we'll just call this metric average order value. On average, in our control, we see an average order value of $2 most of the time. And in our treatment, we see an average order value of $6. Right? This is kind of standard. Adobe Target is really, really good at detecting these differences. It's amazing at detecting these differences. So if we ran this test, we would get a significant result, no problem, no issue. But if you look at the graph on the right, this looks a bit weirder, right? Doesn't look quite the same. Well, what's happening here is that now our control, so the red graph, if we assume these are average order values, have a much tighter distribution. Okay? People are mainly purchasing around $4 items. They're also purchasing $5 and $6 items, and they're also purchasing $3 and $2 items a little bit less. Okay? The blue line, though, shows a very different story. People are purchasing more items at the farther end, but fewer of them on average. And they're also buying more items at the farther left end, so they're buying $1 items, items that are less than $1. Would you believe it that the average value of both of these is 4? They have the exact same average. Using Adobe Target, you could not detect this difference. And that's not a slight on Adobe Target at all. Trust me. It's just a tool. A tool can't do everything in the book. It's not possible. So one of the awesome things about Target is that it makes it really easy to take your data offline and do this yourself. Right? Using A for T, I highly, highly recommend it if you're not doing it already. It's a very, very powerful tool. What we do at Subway is we use A for T for basically every single test. We go into our data warehouse. Then we do an export at the visitor level and segment by test variation. Then we have all the visitors in each variant, and we have visit level details, and we're able to do really cool, complex analysis like this. Okay? So statistics is your friend. It answers really, really interesting questions, and I believe that all of you can do it. It just takes starting it. That's the hard part. Okay, so sadly, we're wrapping up our presentation. We covered 3 important systems. The first one was a system of building hypotheses, right? It's a way of taking our ideas that we have sort of nebulously floating around in our heads and making them concrete. The second system is a method of prioritization. So it's building a model, it's updating that model over time, and then it's scaling that model. The third system is having a method of analysis. So it's understanding that we can get random results. It's reducing those random results through pre-registration. And it's also understanding that we can apply statistical tests in order to answer very, very interesting questions. If you're able to do all 3 of these at scale, the profit will come. Okay? The ROI will come because now it's a matter of efficiency. It doesn't matter what individual test you run. It's not about the individual tests. It's about the overall product. It's about launching many, many tests over time and having each one of those tests being very likely to win and analyzing them in a way where you can extract all the relevant information.
And what comes with profit is a better user experience. But one final thought for you to take away from today, and then we'll go into question and answer, is if you were in ancient Greece and you were advising businesses and kings on what the future was going to hold and what important decision they should make, you'd probably be her. She's the Oracle of Delphi. So these oracles, they are supposed to talk to the gods, come back to the human race, and to tell them what is going to happen next. And the only reason that they survived was basically theater. They had really cool temples, and they would do simple magic tricks. And they also had, of course, confirmation bias. People would walk away, and they'd forget about, and also survivorship bias. They'd remember the successes. But anyway, the point is that you, as a service, as a personalization service, you don't have those. The only thing you have is the rigorous science that you conduct in order to hold the confidence, the credibility of the business that you're serving. And if you don't, you risk losing it. And if you lose it, you won't be able to deliver the sort of personalizations that your employer deserves. So with that, we should keep the conversation going, not only with these 2 links. One is to Chad's LinkedIn posts, so you can read more of what Chad is talking about in what we've discussed here. The second is just the written case of the Subway Accenture success. But let's see if we can answer some questions. Yeah, I'd like to see a show of hand of someone with a question.
Got one right in front.
Oh, well, that's easy. All right, we'll start here. Have you gotten the idea that mostly I'm just moving slides and microphones for Chad? There you are.
So tell me if I'm off base. This is new for me. My question has to do with when you're collecting the data and finding the averages, where's the behavioral aspect of it? Where's the human nature aspect of it? So you have great sets of data, but one may say one thing is more important than the other, but how do you really know that humanistically that's the case?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And the answer is you can't. You can't really know that. What statistics can tell you, which is how we measure differences, all it can tell us is if one metric is significantly better than another metric, right? So if you were trying to measure something like customer happiness, which a lot of people say that they do, probably not going to work out. But if you're measuring something like revenue per visitor, for example, so revenue per visitor is a combination of average order value, conversion rate, and also orders over time. If you're measuring that as your primary metric and that number goes up, then you are objectively making more money. And that's kind of what's most important. Okay? So it is super important. I will grant you it is super important to make sure that the correct.
Okay. Oh yes, it is hot. Okay. Let's go over here. I'll try to be very democratic about this and go to various parts. Here you are.
How do you account for like the offline impact of some of the things that you do online?
Say again?
How do you account for the offline impact for some of the changes you make online, and can you measure it?
Thank you.
Yeah. So that depends. It depends. Sometimes you can. So I'll give you one example that we used recently is when you are making when we were making a change on our website, we had a problem where people were using a input form basically to make changes to their order, and that's not really the way that it should be happening. They should be using the inputs within the flow, and so the people who were receiving those orders, our sandwich artists, were having a really tough time. So we had this offline issue. By making our change, we can then look at the number of people that are completing those sign-in forms or completing those forms and see if we've reduced that number at all. So it's actually pretty easy if you have a metric like that where you can tie your online performance to your offline performance, but you need a metric. And then the other thing that you need is you need some way of being able to tie it back to the variation. And that's pretty tough. If you have something like an omni-channel, when you have multiple different streams coming in and you're able to differentiate between different variants, it's not so bad. But in general, it's pretty tough to do if you're only using target like on a web channel, for example. One of the things that I actually advocate for, and this goes outside of Adobe, is just doing offline experiments as well. It's the same exact principles as what you just saw. It's the same math. Everything is the same. But you conduct the experiment in the store or in the business, or maybe you pick a random set of stores and you change one and then you don't change another, accounting for geography and all those types of things. So there's a lot of different testing you can do that affects the online, but if you don't have those connections synced already, then it's pretty tough. Yeah.
Great. Another. There you are.
How do you account for conflicts in audience segments? So if you have someone who falls into multiple segments, like in multiple different experiences that you're running, how do you either reconcile those or handle them when it comes to looking at your reporting?
When it comes to your analysis?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the way that I like to do it is almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where at the very top is the primary metric, the thing that's most absolutely 100% important to the business. So for Subway, that's revenue per visitor. If revenue per visitor is affected at the aggregate level, the test is over. We don't really need to do too much more analysis because we're going to implement. We can do analysis to understand it better, but effectively we could stop there if we wanted to. The next step down is I look at segmentation metrics, and then, I look at segments, audiences, and also differences in metrics. So you might want to say, I know that returning visitors are all an independent group, and I know that independent users, new users, and all an independent group. And so when you segment those and you look at them separately, then you have that same sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs where, okay, revenue per visitor for new visitors is up significantly. That's a win. We're going to serve that by target. Returning visitors is not up, so either we have to retest it or do something else. So as far as the conflict goes, as long as you do your splits in a way where it's relatively independent, then you should be fine. And really, even if it's not, right? Even if, so let's say, for example, you do a test and you see that users on, I don't know, users who come on the weekend do significantly better and returning visitors do significantly better. Well, if you serve both of those experiences, I mean, your testing tool is basically telling you that for each group, it does better anyway. So overall, it's going to be better. It's going to be up cumulatively. Okay, so there are some issues where you run into trouble with that. I mean, especially on the statistical side. If you want to go over that in detail, I can kind of talk to you about it after. But in general, if you see an effect on any particular audience, then you're usually good to go.
I'm just wondering how much you value confidence levels and confidence intervals.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So just for anybody who is not aware, a confidence level is how Adobe Target measures significance, basically. So if you have a high confidence level, let's say you have a confidence level of 95%, usually this is a sign that your test is good. Mathematically, that's not necessarily what that means. So I strongly value confidence intervals and confidence levels too, but I also know in pretty good detail what they're referring to, and I can look at them objectively. So what a confidence interval or what a confidence level really means, and this is kind of a hard thing to understand sometimes, is that if you have a confidence interval of, let's say, of 95%, that's the inverse of a statistical output called a p-value, which is 0.05. They're corresponding. It's inverse. A p-value of 0.05 only means that you would see the result that you observed 5 out of 100 times in your default data set. So when I'm running a test normally, if there was no B at all, if I'm only looking at A, I would see the increase that I observed about 5 out of 100 times. So then we as human beings need to make a decision, right? We need to say, did that happen? Did that happen because of just random chance and we got super unlucky? Or did it happen because there is a difference? So if you account for everything, if you do all your sort of statistical corrections, and you make sure your test is as valid as humanly possible, in the long run, if you serve tests that hit confidence, whatever your value is, then more often than not, you're going to be correct in the long run. Maybe not for that individual test, though.
Thank you, Chad. So we have time for one more question, and I'm actually going to ask it. It actually is built on that last question about confidence level. And the question is, tell us, well, it's actually a request. Tell us about AA tests at the beginning of any new channel using Adobe Target. What is an AA test? Why is it important for setting confidence levels?
Yep. So an AA test, if you know what an AB test, then you can kind of assume what an AA test is, right? AB test is you have your control, which is nothing's happening. You have your treatment, which is you're making some particular change. So an AA test is you have your control where there's nothing happening, and you also have your control where there's nothing happening, and you're testing those against each other. The reason that that's very important is because, like I said, if there's no difference at all, it's kind of like our basketball metaphor that we were talking about before, about 5 out of 100 times, then we should see a significant result. So if we're running those types of tests and we're seeing significant results way more than 5 out of 100 times, it means something's wrong. It may mean our tagging is wrong. Usually it doesn't mean that the testing software is broken, but it's certainly it should be an inspiration for us to look deeper. We've definitely had our share of tagging issues, and that was one of the main reasons that we figured it out, that this was something that we needed to look into. We were seeing way more significant results than we should. And the problem is, if you start testing without doing those checks, you may have no differences at all in your data that are caused by, things not affiliated with the test. And that's, you know, that's no good. That's bad.
Great. Thank you all for being a wonderful, attentive audience, for having some great questions. We invite you to pose more after this if you don't have to rush off. And
Yeah, come and talk to me or whatever. I'm
Yep.
around. I like talking about this stuff. So.
Chad's on Twitter, I'm on Twitter, or you can just stop by right now. Thank you.
sequence 1 2 1 2.
Test, test.